And now we watch part 3 of the Great Northern War.
A couple of weeks later, a 12,000-strong Swedish army from Pomerania arrived in Krakow as well. Augustus, seeing the gravity of the situation, left Sandomierz with 4,000 cavalry and advanced towards Warsaw to retake it. He had hoped to call for another diet and gather military and financial support from the nobility. The diet did not go according to his plans though, as an increasing number of noblemen voiced their dissatisfaction with the fact that Augustus involved the Commonwealth in the war. Several noblemen even threatened to openly back Charles in the conflict. Growing more desperate.
Yeah, so I remember in the last part that there was a quick little pause in the video, like one of the side things that popped up that the, Polish nobility were super powerful and now they can create issues for the monarch. So, and again, that in conjunction with them not really being all that unified. Yo, Augustus, you sure I got it out of the war when you had the chance, bro.
Augustus sent countless envoys to the Swedish king in the autumn of 1702. However, Charles would not accept any of the terms that were offered. Fearing that all of his offers to Charles would go unanswered, Augustus begged for the aid of his liege via the Electorate of Saxony, the Holy Roman Emperor. Leopold I acquiesced, though his motives were not as selfless as they seemed, as the treaty he offered Charles stipulated that Sweden and Poland would end all hostilities and that all Saxon troops would leave to join the imperial army in the War of the Spanish Succession. The young king dismissed even this offer, as he was determined to defeat Augustus completely. By 1703, Augustus was forced to flee Warsaw again, while Charles continued consolidating his position in Poland. Although we have neglected this theatre,
Charles is restless. This man's ruthless. He just keeps going. Non-stop ruthless aggression for Augustus. He will not rest until this man is completely destroyed.
of war for some time. It is time to return to Ingria and Estonia. As Charles turned southwards after the Battle of Narva, Tsar Peter was given some much-needed time to reinforce and improve the Russian army. Boris Sheremetev, the only Russian commander to have escaped after the Battle of Narva, was given command over the Russian forces in the north. Small raids into Estonia and Ingria were conducted regularly during 1701, but they were not decisive by any means. The first serious attempt to probe the Swedish defences in the area was made in September, when Sheremetev led a 7,000-strong army into Estonia. However, von Schlippenbach intercepted the Russian advance with a 3 times smaller army and defeated Sheremetev at Reuj. On the 7th of January 1702, Schlippenbach, who was posted between Arasfer and Aya, received word from one of his commanders that Sheremetev was advancing with a large force towards his position. Although Schlippenbach received another piece of information that the Russian force was merely a raiding party, he immediately departed towards the village of Aya. The next day at 4 p.m, the alarm sounded that the Russian forces were approaching Varban. Swedish reconnaissance learned that the Russians were carrying 2,000 wooden stakes and 30 cannons, which meant that the force was not a raiding party but an actual army. Still unaware of the true size of the Russian army, Schlippenbach ordered Baron Lewin to harass them with his cavalry, while he gathered as many men as he could. The Swedes were accustomed to fighting while outnumbered, however this time they faced a massive 6-to-1 disadvantage. Facing the 12 to 13,000 strong Russian vanguard, Lewin's forces were easily massacred. The Russian army advanced quickly afterwards, which ensured that Schlippenbach could not muster all of his men. Finally, the two main forces faced each other near the village of Kamar. Schlippenbach had around 3,000 men under his command, as well as 6 artillery pieces. Meanwhile, Sheremetev had 18,000 men and 30 cannons. Schlippenbach, now heading the cavalry, decided to attack a part of the Russian vanguard, to give time to his infantry and artillery to form up and prepare. While the Swedish cavalry was fighting against the sea of Russian soldiers, several Russian regiments cut them off from the rest of their army. This forced Schlippenbach to retreat, suffering minor losses in the process. Although Tsar Peter was doing his best to reform the army, it was only a year after the Battle of Narva, and the Russian soldiers were still inexperienced and poorly trained. Schlippenbach saw the immobile mass of Russian soldiery as the perfect target for his own artillery corps. In a letter to Charles XII, he remarked, "The enemy, having presently followed us, were so well greeted on their arrival by the cannon and foot that they broke and retreated." Finally, the entire Russian army drew up for battle. Judging the situation too unfavorable, Schlippenbach decided to retreat to Arastver.
So Schlippenbach so far is just trying to hold him off, you know, and that little encounter there was really impressive on his part. You know, basically did some damage to the Russians, but now I think a wise strategy, a wise move is not to engage now that they're all together and, you know, now that they're all together and formed for battle, yeah, now it's time to pull back. So I think this was a good move.
Where several hundred Swedish soldiers arrived during the beginning of the battle.
Wix gives you the freedom to tell your story.
The Russian forces were constantly harassing the Swedish army, barely giving them a chance to form up. Finally, at Arastver, Schlippenbach managed to properly deploy his army, with the infantry in the center and the cavalry on the flanks. The battle started with an exchange of volleys. Although the Russian forces vastly...
Do the Russians not have cavalry? I don't see the horse con for theirs. I mean, they have the overwhelming manpower, don't get me wrong. But I don't know if that's going to play a factor or not. Or if the numbers are too great. I mean, look at the gun, the artillery advantage, right? It's also insane on their part, so yeah.
Outnumbered their Swedish counterparts. The fighting was a stalemate due to the Swedish army's superior training. The tide of battle turned when the 30 Russian cannons started firing. Not only did the Swedes suffer major losses due to this, but some of their artillery was disabled as well. Schlippenbach, seeing no other choice, opted for a risky tactic. He ordered his cavalry to alternately cover the infantry and artillery while they were under fire. This move backfired, as the cavalry started fleeing because of the massive incoming fire, and they ran into their own men. Disorder broke within the Swedish ranks, and all the while the Russian army started advancing towards them. Schlippenbach and his officers tried to rally the troops, however it was too late. Some of the cavalry managed to cover the retreat to Dorpat, while much of the infantry was killed or captured. Peter was so elated at the news of his army's victory that he promoted Sheremetev to field marshal and sounded the bells in Moscow for the people to hear.
So Schlippenbach, I think, put up a pretty good resistance. He was outnumbered, obviously, so I feel like that played a huge part. And it was the artillery advantage at the end that did so much, you know. As we know from the Napoleonic era, just the power of artillery and how having more artillery than your enemy is just better. So, you know, the Russian manpower, as they're best known for, fielding such large numbers of armies, especially against the Swedish, who are constantly outnumbered in this series, finally working in their advantage. So, though I am impressed. Schlippenbach definitely did put up a good resistance there, I think.
After Arastver, the Russians faced almost no significant opposition in the area and were able to advance deep into Ingria. In the summer of 1702, the main Russian army, under the command of Peter himself, made preparations at the settlement of Ladoga to assault the Swedish fort of Notbori. Before he would begin the siege, the Tsar wanted to ensure that his army would not be vulnerable to a Swedish surprise attack. With Schlippenbach's army no longer a factor, The only two remaining threats in the area were a 5,000-strong army at Nienschans, led by Kroniot, and the Swedish Ladoga flotilla. With Kroniot unwilling to leave the safety of his fort, and with the destruction of the Ladoga flotilla in late August, Peter was now free to advance on Notburi. The Russian army arrived near Notburi on the 27th or 28th of September 1702. Although the fort of Notburi was in essence a medieval fort, with high walls and towers, it had an excellent defensive position. It was placed on the mouth of the Neva River into Lake Ladoga. In addition, the fort also encompassed almost the entirety of the island, rendering any amphibious assault nearly impossible. Although sources offer diverging details, the size of the Russian army was estimated to have been between 20,000 and 30,000 men, together with 50 artillery pieces. The Swedish garrison was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Gustav Wilhelm von Schlippenbach, uncle of the aforementioned General Schlippenbach. It numbered around 225 men, with 124 guns, most of which were small. On the first days of the siege, Swedish boats freely sailed up the Neva and brought reinforcements and provisions to the garrison. The Swedish defenders now numbered around 250. Peter considered the constant reinforcements a threat to his Ingrian campaign, so he sent 50 gunboats to the Neva River to put a stop to Swedish river operations. The defenders fired their artillery at the boats, however it was ineffective and the Russians suffered no losses. At the beginning of October, Kroniot sent 500 of his own men to Notboyi. In the end, only 50 managed to reach the fort due to Russian attacks. As the Russians had lost all of their artillery at the Battle of Narva 2 years prior, they made an extraordinary effort to replace their lost and outdated artillery pieces, even going as far as to melt down church bells for the material. The new Russian artillery corps was quite effective. The artillery barrages were strong, with the fort's walls and towers beginning to crumble after several days of intense fire. With only a few of the Swedish cannons actually able to reach the Russian army, Russian losses were low. By the 7th of October, the Russian army started preparing for an assault, and on the 9th, ladders were given to the volunteers. The first few minor assaults were easily repulsed by the Swedes, though their aim was most likely to just test the Swedish defences. On the 11th, a large firebomb was shot into the fort, and the mass assault began. With the walls breached in 3 places, the garrison was stretched thin. The first storming was attempted at 4 AM. However, by 6 o'clock it was stopped due to mounting losses and a stubborn Swedish defence. The second assault also failed, while the third one technically succeeded, as the Swedes were left with only a handful of men. That evening, the Swedish commander surrendered the fort and gave Peter the key to the city, which symbolized that Notboyi was the key to the Neva River. Peter, recognizing that as well, renamed the city to Schlüsselburg and placed it under the command of his most trusted general, Menshikov. The siege, though relatively short, left the Russian army exhausted, and the Tsar's desire to repair and improve the fort gave them some time to recover. Charles was aware of the situation in the north, however he did not see the Russian advances as a significant threat, and continued pursuing his goals in Poland. As the campaigning season of 1703 began, the Russian army left Schlüsselburg and advanced towards the mouth of the river Neva. The mouth of the river was guarded by a fort called Nienkrens. Hearing that the Russian army was approaching, the Swedish garrison burned the fort to the ground. Peter the Great captured what was left of Nienkrens on the 1st of May, and on the 27th decided to found a new city there, Russia's future capital, St. Petersburg. In order to build the...
Dang. It's cool to see the origins of this city that we've covered so much about. Oh man, so that's how it begins. Oh, that is beyond impressive. I will say though, Charles is very aggressive. I mean, the Saxons, Augustus, have tried to make peace with him like 100 times. He keeps saying, no, I'm gonna keep fighting you until it's destroyed. Though, I'm thinking maybe he should have just accepted the first peace offer and then dealt with Russia. So far, right now, he refuses every bit of peace that the Saxons Augustus are offering him until he gets, I don't even know what he's going for now, just a complete destruction of them. So he's doing that, and he's not taking the Russians seriously at the moment and their advance, which I think is a big mistake to be making, not taking the Russians seriously. So I will say, I'm starting to, like, I don't know, Charles, I'm not sure about this. But, it's cool to see St. Petersburg at its beginnings now.
Superior city and the fortresses around it, tens of thousands of serfs were forcefully brought to St. Petersburg. Along with them, Peter also invited many architects, engineers and shipwrights from Western Europe to help him build the city of his dreams. These extraordinary efforts seem to have paid off, as by 1704, St. Petersburg began sprawling outwards from the main fortress, and 2 new fortresses were built alongside it. There were several Swedish attempts at reconquering the city in the next few years, however, all of them were unsuccessful. Back in Poland, Charles managed to obtain the support of enough of the Polish nobility to have Stanisław Leszczyński crowned as the new king. On the other hand, Augustus still mounted a significant resistance, as he controlled the majority of the Polish army. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth subsequently descended into chaos, as the Sandomierz Confederation, led by Augustus, and the Warsaw Confederation, led by Stanisław, began fighting a brutal civil war. Due to the chaotic nature of the conflict.
Dude, so Charles just started a civil war. Okay, so he wanted to overthrow Augustus, which I was like, I don't know, I don't think anyone will accept that, but he's determined to get rid of Augustus now. So he basically has just started a civil war, which is hilarious. Oh my.
Forts and cities continuously changed hands between the 2 confederations and Sweden, and it's difficult to discern who controlled several parts of the Commonwealth at different points in time. With most of Ingria secure, and any larger Swedish armies in the Baltic neutralized, in the spring of 1704, Tsar Peter turned towards the last 2 Swedish strongholds in the area, Narva and Dorpat. In April, the commander at Narva, Henning Rudolf Horn, asked the Swedish government for more men and supplies, as Russian soldiers were gathering on the other side of the river. He had also asked the navy to attack Nienszatz to relieve some of the pressure on Narva. It is unlikely that he received any significant aid, and by late April, the few Swedish ships that were present at the mouth of the Narva River were dislodged by Russian artillery. In early May, Russian troops started crossing the river and raiding the countryside outside Narva and Ivangorod. Narva was already suffering from supply shortages due to the large garrison and refugees, and these raids only worsened the situation. With all those people living in unsanitary conditions, disease soon broke out too. At Nienszatz, Peter prepared 2 armies, one for Ingria and another for Karelia. After receiving a letter from General Apraxin that Schlippenbach was planning to take his entire army to Narva, Peter decided to send the entire force there. By late May, the Russians had complete control of the river and the surrounding areas, in effect meaning that Narva was cut off from the rest of Sweden. Schlippenbach's army was too weak to be of any use there, and the other stronghold of Dorpat was under siege too. Narva had been left to its fate. Horn had about 5,000 men under his command, with over 400 artillery pieces. The Russian army consisted of 20,000 men and 99 guns. Horn ordered several sallies in the beginning of June, which were very successful. In one of those sallies, a Russian camp near Ivangorod was looted, and much-needed supplies were brought back to the city. Peter was aware that the garrison was expecting some reinforcements from Revel, so he staged a surprise attack on the 8th of June. The Tsar had some of his men don blue uniforms and hold Swedish banners. Then they staged a mock battle with some Russian troops on the road from Revel. Horn sent a detachment to their aid, falling right.
Wow, that is so devious. Yo, that is devious. Oh, that's so creative. I love that. I love when something like that happens. Like I was thinking like Hannibal Barca when he escaped, when he was trapped by the Romans, that night thing he did where he put a bunch of like torches on oxes, and then had them march at the night, fooling some of the Romans into thinking that was his main army. Like when you see silly stuff like that in war, it's just hilarious. This dude's like, okay, here's what we're gonna do: dress up like Swedish people, the Swedish troops. We're gonna pretend to fight, and oh, that's so genius. It's like a freaking cartoon, but I love that. Oh my goodness. Yo, Peter, he is called Peter the Great after all. With ideas like that, yeah. Isn't it a war crime nowadays to pretend to be someone else? Oh, well, this is a different time. But you know, I don't know why. That's just, I love that. That was creative.
Into the trap. Those troops were immediately ambushed as they lost over 50 men, including a senior officer. On the 18th, the Russians started to dig in, and by the 25th, the entire army was present for the siege. The Russian troops regularly threw hand grenades over the city walls, and they also frequently unleashed musket volleys at the defenders. The defenders were further demoralized when they learned that Boris Sheremetev had taken Dorpat on the 24th of June. By the beginning of July, the supply situation in Narva had become critical. Horn confiscated food from the burghers and the nobles for the army. This meant that the poor in the city were starving, while the rich suffered from food shortages. Over the course of the month, Russian trenches became increasingly close to the walls of Narva, and their hand grenades and musket volleys started actually claiming victims. The defenders regularly fired at the Russian army and even carried out a few sallies, however none of these were effective. In an effort to relieve Narva, a small Swedish army attacked Nyenskans. Unfortunately for the Swedes, they were easily repelled. The Russians had built several bridges over the river in the last month, ensuring that reinforcements and supplies would regularly arrive to their own troops. With the reinforcements, Peter now had over 40,000 men besieging the city. On the 30th or 31st, after Sunday's service, the Russian artillery corps started heavily bombarding Narva. One of the shots hit the gunpowder and chemical warehouse, leading to a massive explosion and fire in the city. With morale being at an abysmal level, soldiers and civilians alike started surrendering and defecting to the Russian side at the beginning of August. The Russian siege leader, Ogilvy, offered lenient terms in return for surrender. Horn, however, asked for a ceasefire instead, and the Russian War Council subsequently decided to storm the city. On the 10th, the signal was given for the assault to start. Regular Russian soldiers started concentrating on the breaches in the walls, while the elite Preobrazhensky regiment climbed the walls of the bastions. Due to precise artillery fire, the Swedish artillery was rendered useless during the assault. The Swedish soldiers defended the breaches bravely, though they were forced to retreat due to concentrated musket fire. As the Russians started streaming through the breaches, Horn had a mine detonated there. This did not stop the attackers for long, as they soon started entering the city en masse. Horn retreated with a handful of men to the walls of the old city, where he was surprised to see that the only soldiers approaching were Russian ones. Left without a choice, Horn surrendered in exchange for mercy towards the city's inhabitants. In spite of the promise given to Horn, brutal looting, rape, and pillaging ensued. 1,800 members of the garrison were imprisoned, while the rest were killed during the battle. On the other hand, the number of civilian—
Wait, he got punched in the face? Okay, to stop the violence on Narva, Peter I stabbed one of his soldiers to death. Oh my goodness. When Horn was captured, he showed off his bloody sword to him and said, "Behold, the blood is not Swedish, but Russian. I stabbed my own to death to contain the fury which you had driven my soldiers." According to sources, he also punched Horn in the face. And even had Horn's dead wife out of his— Wait, what? He even had Horn's dead wife out of his burial And the corpse thrown in. What the? Yo, Peter, what? Peter's insane. What the heck? I'm already loving Peter more and more the more I learn about him.
While the rest were killed during the battle. On the other hand, the number of civilian casualties are thought to be huge, though the exact number is unknown. The Russians lost around 3,000 men. It was at Narva that Peter signed a treaty with Augustus, granting the Saxon monarch significant subsidies, 12,000 Russian soldiers, and lands in Ruthenia in exchange for staying in the war. Over the next year, the Russians and Saxons had devised a strategy to defeat the Swedish army and expel Charles from Poland. The Grodno campaign, as it later became known, aimed to capture the Swedish forces in a pincer movement, with a three-sided offensive from Lithuania, Ruthenia and Saxony. Charles was not sitting idly either, and by the summer of 1705, he had convinced the Diet in Warsaw to start working on a peace treaty and to crown Stanisław as king. As what was going on in Warsaw was seen as a possible catastrophe for Augustus's war effort, not to mention the fact that it represented a significant hit to his pride, he knew that he had to act quickly. A large Saxon cavalry force was sent to assault Warsaw and to stop the coronation of Stanisław. Augustus's reckless endeavour ended in a complete disaster, as the force was defeated by a much smaller Swedish army and its commander was captured. Furthermore, the Saxon commander also divulged the strategic intentions of Augustus and his allies, allowing the Swedes to thoroughly prepare for the upcoming Grodno campaign. As the majority of Livonia and Estonia were under Russian control by the beginning of the campaign, the main Russian army, along with large Saxon and Polish-Lithuanian contingents, set up for winter quarters at the fort of Grodno in Ruthenia. They expected a quick victory over the Swedish army after the campaigning season of 1706 began. However, they did not even get the chance to try. Much like his predecessor, Gustavus Adolphus, Charles force marched his army in the dead of winter and arrived at Grodno on the 24th of January. Lacking the artillery to assault the fort, Charles opted to cross the frozen Neman River and blockade the city. Seeing that the young king was preparing to encircle them, Augustus immediately left with 5,000 men, hoping to reinforce his army in Saxony. Peter, unwilling to bring the rest of his army to relieve the siege, ordered Menshikov to leave the fort with the cavalry as soon as possible. Grodno fell in April, and the Russians lost more than a third of their initial force. They would have lost even more had Charles not misjudged the direction of Menshikov's retreat. Unable to pursue the Russian army through the thick marshlands of Polessia, Charles went westwards to seek a battle with the Saxons. As Charles was busy with the siege, Augustus had prepared to advance towards Warsaw. He led a 7,000-strong cavalry force, while the main body of the Saxon-Polish army was commanded by Schulenburg. A third Saxon army under Brauser was also advancing from Krakow. Schulenburg crossed the Oder on the 8th of February and advanced towards the town of Sława in Silesia. While this was taking place, Reinschild was resting in his winter quarters, which extended from Kostin to the border with Brandenburg. No sooner had he learned of the Saxon advance, he assembled his army and began marching towards the Oder. After discovering the movements of both Schulenburg and Brauser, Reinschild deduced that the two of them planned to avoid open battle with him and join forces at Poznan. To avoid any surprises, the Swedish commander retreated the same way from which he came, and made sure to spread the word at every town and village that he was retreating, and hoping to avoid open battle. Reinschild's information warfare proved successful, as Schulenburg gave credit to the rumors of a Swedish retreat, and decided to pursue the Swedish army instead of advancing towards Poznan.
He knew they wouldn't give him a direct battle, at least on his terms, so he's giving them feinting to make himself seem weaker to give so they give him battle, kind of like what Napoleon did in the War of the Third Coalition against, you know, Russia and Austria. I'm sorry, I keep bringing up other videos, but like, okay, that's smart. I like it. Though everything is starting to get more messy. I noticed. Russia is rising right now. They are dominating at their front. Charles, well, the most part dominating on his part. Now you're starting to see things kind of start getting, like I said, they're getting messy because of all this, you know, internal strife in Poland. So he needs to deal with this quick and quickly turn to the Russians. Like the Russians are just basically dominating without any major resistance, which, you know.
The Saxon general believed that the mere presence of his superior army would be enough to rout the Swedish force. With this strategy, Reinschild achieved two things. He drew Schulenburg's army away from any allied forces, and was able to choose a site of battle that was optimal for the Swedish army's size and composition. Upon both armies reaching the Fraustadt on the 13th of February, Reinschild started arraying...
Dude, Reinschild? I don't think I'm pronouncing that, but I'm impressed by this dude. I might just dub him, depending on how this battle goes, I might just give him the MVP award right now. Like, dang, like, this is devious, but, like, smart. He doesn't seem to have artillery, though. I'm not seeing artillery cannons yet, which kind of worries me.
His army in battle formation. It was at this point that Schulenburg realized that he had been deceived. However, he had to give battle, as it would have been scandalous for him to retreat with such a superior force. The Saxon force was around 20,000 strong, with around 10,000 Saxon and 6,000 Russian infantry, and 4,000 Saxon cavalrymen. Schulenburg assembled his infantry into two columns, between the villages of Jägersdorf and Rösdorf, and in front of it he placed 31 cannons, 44 mortars, and a chevaux de frise. 2,000 Saxon horsemen were placed on either wing. Reinschild had only 9,400 men at his disposal, with 3,700 infantry and 5,700 cavalry. He placed his cavalry on the flanks, and the majority of his infantry in a single line in the centre, while some Karelians were also mixed in among the cavalry. Axel Sparre commanded the infantry in the centre, while Hummerhjelm led the left, and Reinschild himself was in charge of the right.
The number, what's worrying me about the Swedish is that, yeah, the Swedish are used to being outnumbered, but still, that does worry me every time they get into a fight. Also, it's the lack of artillery I'm seeing from the Swedish side that's worrying me as well. They're gonna have to find a way to neutralize the artillery advantage quick if they have a hope of winning, right? Like, artillery's OP, guys, like, I don't know.
As the Swedish army advanced, the Saxons waited until their enemies were at about 100 paces distance. Then they fired all of their cannons and mortars. Although the Swedish army suffered some casualties during this barrage, they did not give the Saxons enough time for another one, as the centre and left started their charge. The Swedish centre's advance was at first checked by the chevaux de frise. However, after less than 15 minutes, the Swedish forces broke through. The Swedes, who were expertly trained at hand-to-hand combat, charged their Saxon counterparts with swords and did not fire a single shot, in spite of being under constant fire.
That's insane. What were they trained in terms of... Because every time they closed the gaps, they seemed to dominate. So, like, what kind of hand-to-hand combat were they trained in? What the heck? I guess with swords he said, but man. Alright. Wow.
The ferocious Karelian onslaught forced the Saxons to retreat towards the village of Bezen. The Swedish wings had even more success, as the numerically inferior Saxon cavalry began fleeing after just several minutes of fighting. Only a handful of cavalry on the Saxon right, led by Colonel Kospot, mounted a desperate defence. However, they were surrounded and broken after the rest of their wing fell. The Swedish right afterwards came upon the 6,000 Russian soldiers. The Russians had their uniforms turned inside out, as Schulenburg knew that they were inexperienced and Reinschild would target them. Their weakness was revealed though. The Russians fired only one volley at the Swedes before throwing down their arms and retreating behind the wall of spikes.
And they're about to be, what, completely encircled? Oh my goodness.
After removing the chevaux de frise there, Reinschild chased down the entire Russian force and massacred them all. As all of the Saxon cavalry had fled, their Swedish counterparts were now free to surround the remainder of the army on all sides. Much like Hannibal almost 2 millennia.
Dude, I know, that's exactly what I was thinking. He just pulled off 2 encirclements right there. Oh my goodness.
Before him, Reinschild executed a double envelopment perfectly, forcing the remainder of the Saxon army to surrender.
Okay, Reinschild, I don't know who the heck you are. You literally came out of nowhere. But I dub you the MVP of this battle. You joined the ranks of Marshal Davout, Marshal Massena, General Desaix, and several other people. You guys notice throughout the series, I'll usually just single someone out who does incredibly well, and then just give them the MVP award. Reinschild has joined the ranks, and now he is MVP.
And with that, the entire Saxon army, raised with so much toil, care and expense, and which was twice the size of the Swedish army, had been defeated in less than an hour's time. The Saxons lost more than 7,000 men during the battle itself, and had almost all of the rest imprisoned, with the total losses amounting to about 15,000 to 16,000. The Swedes lost around 400 men, and also had around 1,000 men injured. Augustus's biggest problem, however, was that the road to Saxony now lay wide open and undefended. Augustus, who linked up with Brauser and had 12,000 men at his disposal, was only 80 kilometers away from Fraustadt when the battle took place. Shocked at the news of his Grand Army's complete defeat at the hands of an inferior Swedish force, Augustus hastily retreated to Krakow. Since Peter the Great was unwilling to send his army to even relieve the siege of Grodno, there wasn't any hope of Russian aid for them either. After his victory at Grodno, Charles XII turned west to prepare for the upcoming invasion of Saxony. In the next few months, Augustus desperately tried to negotiate a peace with Charles, even offering to split up the Commonwealth between himself and Stanislav. As autumn began, the Swedish armies marched into Saxony and quickly occupied Leipzig.
Dude, Augustus' entire series has been throwing peace offers at Charles, who just keeps refusing all of them. Charles is relentless. He's like, he really has it out for Augustus. He refuses every chance of peace. He really wants to overthrow this man. Dang. This is what Napoleon should have done to, like, Emperor Francis of Austria. Are you kidding? By this point, Napoleon would have made peace like 100 times, and then get jumped again and again. But not Charles. Charles is like, I'm just gonna keep fighting until he is gone. I don't want him around anymore. Like, oh my goodness. But I think all this neglect of Russia is gonna be his undoing. He's neglecting Russia and Peter way too much. But, oh well.
Without any other options, Augustus agreed to all Swedish demands and signed the Treaty of Elternstadt. According to the treaty, he would renounce all of his claims to the Polish and Lithuanian crowns, annul treaties with Russia, and extradite the Swedish traitor Johann Patkull. In order to humiliate his personal enemy, Charles also forced Augustus to congratulate Stanislav on his victory and coronation.
Dude, Charles hates him. Dang, Charles. Good move, my man. Good move. GG, you finally got rid of Augustus. Now you need to focus on Russia. Russia's been, like, the secret threat he's neglected. But yeah, we're gonna end this part here. I'm gonna jump to the next part, in which will come out tomorrow. Bye, everyone.